Hi everyone, my name is Professor Tanya Hertz, and today we are on Chapter 3, which is global trade, global business. I think the name of the chapter is The World Marketplace, Business Without Borders. So let's go ahead and pull up the lecture notes for Chapter 3. PowerPoint lecture notes. Again, you'll need to fill in the blank spots as we go. And we know that, excuse me, access to technology is on the rise. Developing countries represent the big business opportunities in terms of both their size and economic growth. We know that different economies around the world are becoming more interdependent than ever before, and this has really created a tightly woven global economy where there is intense competition and there are huge opportunities. And we found through a lot of recent research studies that people have more access to technology, and that when people have access to cell phones, and when the percentage of the populations with cell phones goes up, the entire economy benefits. So the BRIC countries are Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and they deserve attention because of their large populations, their rapid development, their robust middle class growth rates. Vietnam, the Philippines, and Bangladesh are all benefiting from the migration of labor-intensive, low-wage manufacturing jobs away from China. And as more jobs are created, these locations will likely begin to develop a robust middle class and stabilized economies. So a number of sub-Saharan African nations such as Nigeria, Kenya, Angola also provide tremendous opportunity for economic growth. Companies usually think of expanding into global markets when they realize that there is a new, unexplored, and growing market to be exploited, but there are other benefits too. International trade is advantageous to firms that want to capitalize on factors of production that are not present in the right amount at the right place, at the right price rather, in a particular country. Global trade helps reduce dependence on one economy. This reduces the economic risks for multinational companies. International trade promotes innovation and is an invaluable source of new ideas for companies. Industries tend to be more successful if they get to operate in countries that have a competitive advantage. And we talked about competitive advantage before. And the concept of competitive advantage depends on the understanding of how opportunity cost relates to international trade. When a country produces more of a particular commodity, it must produce less of another commodity, simply because of the available resources that are there are ultimately limited. Thus, the value of production and the value of the product that a country gives up to produce its best product is known as an opportunity cost. A country has an absolute advantage when it can produce more of a good than other nations, using the same amount of resources as the other nations use. Although having an absolute advantage is beneficial in most countries, it's not so in all countries. And that's an important thing to notice. It's not always enough. So balance of trade determines if a country has a trade deficit or a trade surplus, and it takes into consideration the value of goods as well as services. The balance of trade determines the balance of payment. Balance of payment also considers financial flows such as foreign borrowing and lending, and foreign aid payments, receipts, etc. So trade surplus is the overage, and a trade deficit is the shortfall that occurs when nations' imports are either higher or lower than the total value of the exports. So again, balance. This shows a balance of payments that we talked about a little bit before. Balance of payment is the measure of the total flow of money in or out of a country. A surplus is the overage. A deficit is the shortfall when either more or less money flows in or out of the nation. So the exchange rate of a given currency has to, by definition, it must be expressed in terms of another currency. Companies indulge in counter trading when customers don't have access to hard currency or to credit. This situation is more common in developing countries. We see this. And if it's done well, counter trading can be a powerful tool for companies to gain customers and to products that otherwise would not be available without counter trading. Although foreign outsourcing reduces costs, the risks involved, oh, and I should say this, foreign outsourcing is contracting with foreign suppliers to produce products or to provide goods or services. And it can reduce costs, but the risks can also be very high. Quality control, social responsibility, serious risks where we can control how we behave in our home country. Things like child labor, long work hours, low wages can all be risks associated with outsourcing. Outsourcing, I should say, outsourcing is not always the same as offshoring, but foreign outsourcing is, you can look at foreign outsourcing as synonymous with offshoring. Okay, offshoring. So importing and importing products don't typically carry the name of the importer, and so the risks involved tend to be lower. Small and mid-sized companies aimed at basic international markets and market development choose exporting. And many foreign licensing and foreign investments are higher levels of international marketing commitments. The licensor is entitled to a fee that the licensee has to pay. This requires minimalistic investment from the licensor's end and also helps circumvent the government restrictions. Many franchisors offer to guide their franchisees on the management practices, on the market, etc. In return, franchisees are expected to pay startup fee and an ongoing percentage of sales to the franchisor. One of the biggest deterrents of direct investment is the huge cost involved in such investments. However, a lot of companies who take this approach have more control of their business operations in the new market that they enter. So joint ventures, they're popular, but they can also be kind of a risky or controversial means of entering a foreign investment. So a joint venture is different than or it can be the same, but typically different than direct investment or outsourcing. It's definitely different than outsourcing or offshoring. A joint venture is when two or more companies will join forces to pursue whatever the opportunity is that they want to pursue together, but they don't necessarily share any ownership, right? So for example, let's say the company that we're looking at is Ford, right? So Ford might do a joint venture with a Mexican car company wherein they produce something together without Ford actually buying or owning the other country. So it's a type of foreign investment without necessarily offshoring. So, did I say offshoring? I'm sorry. Let me go back to that. Without necessarily developing ownership, it's a type of of strategic alliance. It's a type of strategic alliance, type of strategic alliance. So partnerships and strategic alliances. So these are joint ventures, right? These are joint ventures. And so a joint venture is anytime two or more companies will join their forces, sharing resources, sharing risks, sharing profits, but not ownership, okay? So they're sharing their resources, they're sharing their risks, they're sharing their profits, but they're not merging their ownership, okay? They're not merging the companies. And they do this so they can pursue specific opportunities. Joint ventures are popular. A strategic alliance is a type of a joint venture. It's an alliance wherein people, I didn't say that right. I'm so sorry. So joint ventures are where companies share resources, risk, and profit, like I said, but they don't necessarily merge companies, and they don't necessarily merge ownership. So in a partnership, right, they actually do merge ownership. So there is co-ownership of companies. So it's typically the larger company that's offshoring or outsourcing to own a company in a foreign country. In a strategic alliance, they never share ownership. So they have that alliance between one another, but they're not owning one company or another. If that makes sense. I hope I wasn't unclear on that one. Sorry about that. So most of the challenges that we see with international trade, they fall into one of these three categories: sociocultural, economic, or political and legal differences. And the challenges that companies see are going to vary from country to country. Typically, countries with the most trade barriers have the least competition, which tend to be a tremendous source of opportunity for smaller companies, for companies that haven't entered foreign markets before, to really break through and access some of the benefits that they can get from international trade. So national governments are authorized to set up barriers that restrict or regulate or in some way hinder international trade or international businesses. We call this practice protectionism. So governments typically use tariffs to shield new industries, fledgling, nascent industries that would shut down if they didn't get help from the government to support the industries that are typically important in our domestic economy. VERs, voluntary export. Do I have a slide? I think I have a slide on VERs. VERs are voluntary export restraints. These are typically imposed by the exporting country. They're usually done out of fear that the importing country would impose even more onerous or restrictive policies. Embargoes, countries typically levy embargoes to pressure the targeted country into changing their political policies, or they can be done to protect national security, etc. So some countries use non-tariff barriers because, complaints about them could be hard to prove, but easy to counter. So often you'll see that. I don't know if I talked about I think I talked about GATE in one of the subsequent chapters. I'm trying to think of one or two. GATE is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was established in 1948 by 23 nations. Let's see. Now, the most significant changes stem by there were many more negotiations. I'm sorry. I was looking back at my notes. There were many rounds of negotiations or changes to GATE. The changes from 1986 to 1994, we called this the Uruguay round of negotiations. Those were the biggest changes. Now, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, came into existence because of that those Uruguay round of negotiations that I told you about, 1986 to 1994. Apart from the functions mentioned on this slide, the WTO also monitors the provisions of GATE. the ministers of the WTO meet once every 2 years, and the World Bank was actually established as part of the WTO after World War II. And I don't know if you know this, but after the WTO created the World Bank, really the primary reason that the World Bank was even established was to offer advice to fledgling nascent countries, to help them to be successful, to give advice, particularly financial advice to the governments of developing countries. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I had a slide. Oh, yes, I have it here. So the member nations of, we talked a little bit about the World Bank. Again, it's part of the WTO, created it, 188 member countries. It's designed to reduce poverty, gives technical advice, financial advice to governments, again, in nascent countries. The member nations provide the IMF. Talk about the IMF. The member nations of the IMF provide funds. The IMF is best known for the help that it provides to nations that are facing financial problems. At the end of 2005, the IMF implemented a debt relief program to poor countries. Because of this program, the IMF has been able to forgive the loans taken by 35 poor countries, which was pretty encouraging. World Bank and IFM are designed to encourage nations to adopt sound policies, to promote trade, and to lend money when people are facing, or I'm sorry, not people, but people within nations are facing economic trouble. So, come back here. Even though free trade is not a reality, the emergence of trade blocs, common markets, international trade agreements has really moved international trading closer to that goal. There are several different trade blocs. Trade blocs are countries that have done just that. They've reduced or eliminated tariffs. They're designed to allow free flow of goods across member nations. I think, I don't know, I don't want to give it away, but try to think of a couple of trade blocs. Try to think of trade blocs. Like, which trade blocs have you heard of? There's a few for me that come immediately to mind, and those are NAFTA, maybe, and the EU. The EU. So NAFTA came into existence. It's the United States, Mexico, and Canada. They joined forces to form the largest trading bloc, and we call that trading bloc NAFTA. And NAFTA came into existence in 1994, gradually eliminating trading barriers and investment restrictions over a 15-year period. However, it is said that pollution and worker abuse have significantly increased because of NAFTA. So there are some problems, and I'm sure you've heard more some of the issues associated with NAFTA in the news. Now, the EU is 28 European countries that have come together to form the largest common market that we've ever seen, and we call that common market the EU. It is said to have a combined GDP of approximately, this is the most recent number that I have, almost $18 trillion, over $17 trillion. It has successfully removed all trade restrictions among its member countries. It has also unified the internal trade rules. The EU has also created standardized policies for import and export between the EU countries and the rest of the world. The most economically significant move of the EU was the introduction of the euro. The EU affects the global economy with leading-edge approach to environmental protection, quality production, and human rights. So we've talked about some of the good things associated with these trading blocs. So why would we create trade restrictions? Well, trade restrictions are created to protect domestic industry and jobs, to protect national security interests, to oftentimes retaliate against countries who have engaged in unfair trading practices, or to put pressure on other countries to change some of their policies. some of the reasons people eliminate, or countries rather eliminate, trade restrictions is to reduce prices, to improve the amount of choices that consumers can have, to give more job opportunities, to give exporting opportunities by creating better relationships, and to use their resources more efficiently on a worldwide basis. If we don't think nationally and we think more globally, it allows us to be more efficient in the way that we operate. So one of the things that I'd love for you to look at as part of looking at the at world business, I'd really love for you to look at Hofstede's taxonomy of working with people from different countries. I put it in Canvas for you. It's actually, I think it's either part of your homework or part of the discussion post for chapter 3, but review Hofstede's. It's really helpful with for those of us who do have to operate on a global scale and conduct some form of international business. And for almost every business out there, it's becoming a reality today. All right, so that's it for chapter 3. I will see you all in chapter 4.